Hello, and welcome to another episode of Breaking the Guard. On today's episode, I'm going to talk about another story. This one, not martial arts related, at least not directly, but it's actually a time where I nearly died. I was, to cut to the chase, I almost drowned in 90 feet of water in the Galapagos. And if you've been on following me for some time, you've probably read the article that I wrote about this in my old blog. It actually got a lot of traction over the years, but I figured it would be good to retell it in video format, and I could elaborate a little bit more on the backstory, and it's also lessons I learned from that experience. Okay, so to start off, I must have been with my wife, girlfriend at the time, for a few months, and we were planning our second vacation together, and that was to go to the Galapagos. Now, at the time, we weren't planning to go scuba diving. We were just gonna visit the big island there, which is Isabella. It's the biggest but most remote island of the Galapagos chain. Usually tourists are not flocking there. Like the other islands have casinos and major hotel chains. In Isabella, at least at the time that we went, there was no major hotels. There was very few areas that even had Wi-Fi, and you would hear evangelists complaining on the radio about too much technology uh, when it was very scarce, at least from our point of view. But a beautiful island. Uh, Nonetheless, we weren't planning to go scuba diving. We weren't certified in scuba diving. Didn't own any scuba diving gear. So I think it was like 4 or 5 months that we had booked most of that trip. About 6 weeks out, I thought, man, it would kind of be a waste to not go scuba diving at the Galapagos. And my brother was scuba diving at the time, and he bought his own gear and stuff. So I thought, you know what? Let's get certified. Um, it shouldn't take us long, and that way we can at least do a dive or two when we're there. Our first experience going scuba diving in Miami was not great. It was, I think, in December. So the water was coldish for Miami, right? Not really cold for anybody else. But it was very choppy, and that was the bigger part. And we ended up going on a big dive boat. There was probably like 20 something other divers there. And there was another dive boat also that was certifying divers. And if you've never been scuba diving before, when it's choppy, uh, it's not great to be on the surface. And what ends up happening when they have these big groups is that they wait for everybody to kind of form smaller groups with their dive master. And the dive master is basically the instructor, he's the guy in charge of that group. And you end up having lots of people just floating on the surface where the waves are very choppy. And that's the worst part. Like in the water, it's not that bad. But on the top of the surface, you're bouncing up and down. So getting off the boat into the water, not great, but then we dove and it's fine. But the worst part was getting out, because getting off the boat into the water is fairly quick. Getting onto the boat when there's 20 other people in front of you that have never done it before, and this boat in particular had you getting on it with your fins on, which is awkward. Uh, Very difficult, and a lot of people were banging tanks, because they don't know how to space out. And I think there was quite a few people that got seasick, including myself and my wife. And I think that was the only time I can recall being seasick, was on that trip. So it's funny because at that point my wife's like, I don't want to go uh, scuba diving ever again. But I already paid for the certification, and it was like a 2 day thing. And I go, let's let me see if I can find a private instructor so that we don't have to go in this giant, group, and maybe it'll be a lot better. And I was able to find someone that would do it private, and tremendous difference, right? It was just us and the instructor. Uh, it costed maybe $100 or so more, 100% worth it. And then she enjoyed the experience. So we ended up getting our uh, diving certification, and just maybe like 2 weeks before we were going to fly to Ecuador to go to the Galapagos. We didn't have any equipment. I contacted our hotel to make the arrangements for the local agency there that would be doing the diving, and to see if they would rent us equipment. They said yes. Okay, so we got there. Now, when we get there, uh, first time me jumping into the Pacific Ocean for diving, it is cold. It's like in the 60s there. And while 60s doesn't sound cold in air, in water, it's very cold. Especially if you're going to be in there for, 30, 45 minutes. It's cold. So they have to layer us in wetsuits. My wife has so many, she has like multiple layers of wetsuits, and she's so buoyant that you throw her in the water and her chest is like sticking out. Uh, they have to put lots of weight just to counteract her buoyancy. But all the gear is very shabby, and my depth gauge, basically when you're diving, you have a bunch of equipment on you, and one of them is a depth gauge, and it tells you how deep you are in the water. It also tells you how much oxygen you have left in your tank. Mine is broken. The depth doesn't work, and I can't recall if it was telling me the right amount of air. I think it was. Yeah, it was just the depth gauge that was broken. And the dive master's like, "Oh, don't worry about it. Just stay with me." And I'm like, "Okay, understand. This is going to be our first real dive, and we were slated for 4 dives, so just baby us. We're not supposed to go below 60 feet or something like that, because we were just a beginning diver certification." And he's like, "No problem. It's going to be nice and easy. We're in a small group. I think there was like 6 of us total diving. It'll be fine." So we start diving, and first 3 dives go great. No mishaps at all. Got to see a giant hammerhead in the water. It was probably like a 16 to 18 foot hammerhead shark. A great hammerhead. Very cool. Uh, that was the only real big sighting of uh, that scuba dive trip. We also got to swim with a manta ray, or at least I tried to. It was running away, and I was just chasing after it as fast as I can. So that was cool. Final dive. Before jumping into the water, my mask, I had noticed, was leaking a lot, and I had to constantly trying to flush out the water when I was diving. So I thought, you know what, let me tighten my mask up a little bit. So I tightened it up a little bit, jump into the water, and then we start diving. We go what seems to be deep, but again, I don't know the depth because I'm just a beginner, and also my depth gauge is broken. But I just follow the dive master. I'm the last person in the group. When you're diving, you always buddy dive, which means that you and your partner are always together. In this case, there was a dive master, there was a group of 2, and then the one guy was paired up with the dive master as well, so he wasn't alone, and then it was me and my wife. The problem was all of us were using rental gear, right? So we all looked the same, and she was following somebody else, thinking that was me. I was following her, last guy in the group, okay? At one point, there's a big rock formation, and then kind of like a little half cave, if you will. So it's kind of like an arch like this, and they're gonna go swim through it. Not a big deal. I start paddling down, and for some reason, when I start paddling down, suddenly I see my vision go start closing in. Like I see the black closing in. So I stop and I pull up a little bit, and then I stay there. I'm like, oh, what's going on? I'm like, okay, let me try again. On the second time, I try to paddle down. My vision closes in again, but this time it closes completely. So now I'm completely blind. Can't see a thing. Fully conscious, I'm lucid, but I can't see anything. My first instinct here is to signal for help. I start waving around a little bit, maybe like 10 seconds. I get no response. I grab my flashlight. I start flashing it. I get no response. And at this point now, I estimate I was alone for about a couple minutes. In my head now, I'm thinking, well, I must be under this little shelf I told you about, like this half cave, and they probably can't see me. I need to try to swim to what I think is up, which is not easy because one, I'm blind, I'm underwater, and two, there's a lot of current. So you're getting moved around and sloshed all over the place. So I start trying to swim to what I think is up. And after a couple minutes, I feel the ocean floor on my feet. So now I start getting into the situation where I'm thinking, okay, I'm in trouble here. How am I going to get out of this? And I think of a few options. One, I can try to wait around here and hope that they circle back to find me. Maybe they're already looking for me and they're having some trouble. But we were probably about halfway through this dive, and I was the first one to run out of air in the group. I was the biggest guy at the time. So this was not a great idea for me because, again, I don't know how deep I am in the water, and maybe they find me, but I'm out of air and I've drowned, right? So the second option I thought of was, well, I can inflate my BCD, which would float me to the surface, but there are a lot of problems with that, right? Your BCD is basically a vest. It's a buoyancy control device. And when you fill it with air, when you're at depth, what happens is you will start to rise. You'll get positively buoyant, so you'll start to float. But the higher you go, the quicker you go, and you end up going up too fast. And without being able to see and control it, you're basically going to rocket your way up. Now, there's a lot of issues with this. One, you might suffer some barotrauma. Sometimes this is, you can end up getting the bends where you have nitrogen that has come out of solution, and you have bubbles basically, and those are not able to be dissolved in time because you moved too quickly. Typically, when you're diving, you do what's called a safety stop around 15 to 20 feet. Stay there for 3 minutes, which is supposed to help remove anything like that. If I just filled myself up, I would just skyrocket up. I wouldn't drown, but I would have to deal with medical complications on the surface. Now, the other problem is we were about 30 to 45 minutes from the island that we're at. That island does not have a decompression chamber. So we would have to then get transportation to the main island and then get transferred to a decompression chamber. There were going to be a lot of problems, right? So although I may have not died at that moment, I may have had some serious health complications. But at that time, that was going to seem to be the best option for me, right? Because otherwise, I felt it was a certain death at the bottom of the ocean. Now, I went through a lot of talk to come through with this to you guys, but at the moment, I felt like it probably took me about a minute to make my decision as far as what I was going to do. But before I did, I felt the pressure of my mask being very tight. I'm like, I need to take this mask off. So there's a process in scuba diving where you can clear your mask, where I can take the mask completely off. Basically, you keep your eyes closed and you can clean it underwater, then put it back on. And by blowing out through your nose, you can flush all the water inside the mask out to the top and clear the mask. And I was familiar with doing this because I was getting a lot of mask leaks, right? So when I did that, I felt the pressure relieve and then I got my vision restored. But I was seeing double. That was fine though, because now that I could actually see something, I could figure out where to go as far as coming up to the surface. Now, when my vision restored, I was nowhere near where I remember last being. Right? I did not see the cave. I was on some slope somewhere. I was way off course. And again, like I said, it was so much current there that it doesn't surprise me that I was blown off course. But my thought at that moment was, I need to get up to the surface quickly because I don't know where my people are, and they are probably trying to find me. And I don't want them getting worried, particularly my wife, right? And I also don't want to get stranded either, because we did come in a boat. If they end up leaving without me, I'm screwed, right? So I made my way up safely as best I could, although I couldn't read my air gauge because I said I was seeing double, but I kind of just eyeballed, as far as how but coming up, you can figure it out because basically don't go faster than your bubbles, right? So that's fairly doable. And eyeballing 15, 20 feet is not too difficult. It doesn't have to be an exact science either. So I just got myself up, stayed at a depth for about 3 to 5 minutes, and then made my way to the surface. When I got to the surface, I started looking around. I was trying to find the buoy for where the divers were. Typically, a dive master has a little floaty at the top, which kind of lets you know where the group is at. I couldn't see it. I also couldn't see the boat. So for a moment, I was a bit concerned, like, oh, crap. And I had to turn, and then I looked pretty far, and then I saw the boat. Right? And it might have been because my vision was kind of messed up too. And once I saw the boat, I started doing this sign here, which means I'm in trouble, rescue, save me. However, the boat's response to me when I started really straining to look was they were just pointing at a direction. And I kept doing this, and the boat did not respond with other than pointing. So then I looked to try to figure out what they're pointing at. And then at the distance, I could see the buoy. So I'm like, oh, okay, let me go there because that's where they're at. And let me tell them what's going on, right? So they know that I'm okay. So it took me a few minutes to be able to reach that buoy. And then the buoy itself has a line that goes to the dive master, whoever's holding it. So I started swimming down, and took me a few minutes to be able to come down to them. When I finally got to them, I saw them all there, and I looked at the dive master. He looks back at me, and then he's like, okay. And this is the okay sign for diving, right? And I'm like, not okay, right? Not good. And then he basically signaled to me to stay with them as long as I could. But when I looked over to check on my wife, when she makes eye contact with me, she freaks out. I can see underwater, she is not, she didn't realize I was gone. She thought she was following me the whole time. So then I'm sure she was wondering what the hell happened, where did I come from, and who the hell was she following the whole time. Anyhow, I stay with them as long as I can, but because I've done, now 2 entrances, I had to make my second exit early, but at least now I knew I was all right. I was able to do my safety stop again by myself, get up to the surface, and I was the first one on the boat, right? When I get back on the boat, everyone on the crew is looking at me really odd. And I figured, okay, something happened to my face, right? Because they're looking at me like I got messed up, right? And my vision's still wonky, right? So I go into my cabin after I take off my gear. I look in the mirror, and I can see that my eyes are sucked out, right? I look like Arnold Schwarzenegger in the the first Total Recall movie when he gets on Mars on the surface with basically there's no atmosphere and he's getting his eyes sucked out. That's how I looked like. I had two big black eyes on each eye and my face was literally pulled. So I'm like, not good, right? But I'm like, well, at least I'm alive. When my wife finally rejoins me, she's like looking after me and she's a bit concerned. But I'm like, well, my vision is getting better slowly. I think I'll be fine after, some rest. When the dive master comes to check on us, he's like, oh, yeah, we were just about to go back and find you. And in my head, I'm like, how do you figure? I was pretty far from where you guys were at. I mean, they would have never found me. Right? I don't think they would have, at least they would have not found me in time. So I realized there, like, man, I trusted the wrong man with my life here. And this is where, well, I'll get into the lessons part later, right? Um, but the story doesn't end there. So I survived this ordeal, and we still have some days left in the vacation. We enjoy it, and we come back home. When I come back home, they are doing construction now across from where the condo I was living at the time. I think they were building a new condominium across from where we were living. So they would start, of course, at the crack of 6 a.m. And I like getting up a little bit later. So I have my hearing protection I use for shooting. So I would put that on when I went to sleep to kind of make sure I don't get woken up by the construction. However, something happened where when I would put those earmuffs on, I would hear the ocean. And I was like, oh, son of a bitch. Because it reminded me of what I was hearing when I was underwater by myself alone in the dark, especially when I'm trying to sleep and I'm closing my eyes. Because while I'm talking to you here, there's obviously a lot of noise. When I was underwater, there's no noise. It's just the ocean. I just hear the waves. And for whatever reason, when I was putting on the hearing protection, that's the same sound I was hearing. So after a few days of that, I told my wife, we're going to do advanced certification now. And the reasoning I had was, I'm not going to have this type of like trauma haunting me uh, for the rest of my life, or being afraid of this, because I had a bad incident. So what I realized was, now we'll get into the lessons, right? One, I went to do something that requires training and discipline with very little preparation, right? Scuba diving is dangerous. It's not a safe sport. There's a lot of things that can go wrong if you're not careful. Now, that doesn't mean like it is inherently dangerous and people shouldn't approach it. Just like driving's dangerous, or jiu-jitsu can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. Scuba diving is dangerous. You need to respect it, and you need to go into it with the proper care and training. So although we did do the certification, in retrospect, that wasn't enough preparation, right? Particularly the Galapagos are a difficult site to dive because of the current. And although the current itself wasn't really the factor here, it definitely didn't help. So it would be like if I was going to compete in a jiu-jitsu tournament and go into the black belt division with 1 week of training. Wouldn't it be a great idea? Are you going to get hurt automatically? Not necessarily, but you can get brutalized, right? Especially if you were like in a pro division and a guy is going to break your arm and you're just like some 1 week white belt wanting to like test your chops. Like that would be a bad time, right? So didn't have enough training and preparation, right? Two, not having my own gear hurt me in a lot of ways. One, since my gear was broken, I didn't know how deep I was, and I was having issues operating the mask, right? It turns out that what happened was that I had built up too much pressure in the mask, right? Which is called a mask squeeze. And when I tightened the mask, even though it resulted in not as much leaking going on, I wasn't getting the pressure out because the space inside the mask is pressurized. And as you get deeper, it now is different than the pressure outside, and essentially it starts to suck. And that's why what you're supposed to do is blow out through your nose as you start getting deeper to equalize the pressure inside the mask with the pressure outside the water. I wasn't doing this because I wasn't really trained to do that. As a beginner diver, you're usually diving below, above 60, so 0 to 30 feet usually, in which that doesn't even matter. You're not building enough pressure for that to make a difference. Well, it turns out that when we got to the bottom, because I had asked the dive master, we were at 30 meters, which puts us somewhere around 98 feet. That was way deeper than what we were supposed to be. And I had told him not to take us that deep. He still took us that deep. And that's deep even for regular divers, right? Like, you usually don't hang around 98 feet for a long time if you're in air, right? So, not having a depth gauge, I didn't know to avoid that, right? And also not having the training, not recognizing that I was developing a mask squeeze. Now, normally people, when they get a mask squeeze, do not go blind, right? That is very unusual. I guess I was just unlucky in that situation. Most people will get bloodshot eyes, meaning that the blood vessels in the front of the eye burst. So now their eyes get bloodshot, but their vision is not obstructed. In rare situations like mine, the blood vessels in the back of the eye burst, and it somehow blocks the optic nerve, shutting down your vision, which is what happened to me. And when I was able to relieve the pressure by taking the mask off and equalizing, then it basically allowed the vision to restore. Like I said, very unusual circumstance. Most people don't have that issue. I just happen to be one of the people that were unlucky to have that. However, that just goes back to not having the right training gear, right? Again, that's like going to a sparring session without a mouthpiece or with like Taibo, cardio kickboxing sparring gloves instead of real sparring gloves, right? Like, you're gonna have a bad time. You're not equipped properly. The other thing is that by not having our own gear, it was harder to identify each other, right? Since I was built similarly to someone else in the group, and we're all wearing essentially black wetsuits. We all look the same. So my wife didn't realize to follow the right person. And now, after this experience, we all got our own gear, and we have our own things that make us stand out and look unique. So we know exactly who we're following at any moment. The other thing I got was more protective gear, as far as signaling gear, rather. And the thing I got was a water hammer, which is basically like a small cylinder, kind of like this. And you shake it, and it has ball bearings inside that rattle, and they make a lot of noise in the water. So even if you're not able to reach somebody to touch them to signal or be able to visually get them to recognize you, you start shaking that thing, and everything in the water hears you, pretty easily. So now I won't dive without that thing. I also have what they call the safety sausage now, where I can essentially fill up my own buoy and signal to the top. So at the very least, even if I am stuck underwater and I can't surface, people will at least know where I'm at because I can float that to the surface. So I looked to first be better prepared when taking on a new activity, right? Not to just jump into something that is dangerous. 2, invest in better gear. 3, invest in better training. That's why I went to do the the advanced open water diver from Patty, right? Just getting more certification, getting more training, being able to deal with more difficult situations, right? And I went with that same private instructor we did last time, but obviously covered a lot more material so that I could be better prepared. The other thing was trusting the right people. The guy that we used for that trip in Galapagos was reckless, right? He was nice, but he was reckless, right? He shouldn't have been pulling us that deep in the water. He shouldn't have lost track of his divers for that long, right? There was only 5 people in his care, and he lost essentially 20% of the crew without recognizing that he had lost it. And he was, again, I had to be at least out of the group for 10 minutes at the minimum. Probably longer, being honest, probably 15 minutes. That's a long time. 10 minutes in the water, it's a long time where you could really lose somebody, especially when there's current pushing you around. And him being very nonchalant about it, also not cool either, right? So I learned that as well, which is you have to trust the right people, right? Again, it's like going to a McDojo and thinking you're learning the real martial arts, right? Like you trusted the wrong person. So another thing that I had to look out for, right? So when we factor all these things in, have the proper respect for engaging the activity, we get the right equipment tested, make sure it works. We have the right training and preparation so we know how to handle difficult situations as they arise. Have the right people around you being able to look after you. And also, part of the training was making sure that my wife knew as well that we're a team. We have to be looking out for each other. We can't just trust somebody else to look after us, right? Since then, I've racked up a couple hundred dives, right? And no incidents since. Well, I had one issue with a sinus squeeze, not a big deal though. I was able to take care of that myself. But other than that, no incidents in the diving. So the enhanced level of respect, the more training, has really improved, and also just terminated that potential phobia. Right, I can put on hearing protection without hearing the ocean. Right, so I was able to use some adversity and turn it around to make it something now that I enjoy doing. I think one of the things that probably saved my life was my martial arts training, because you might have heard me tell that whole story, and it sounded very like cold, not emotional, very logical, and you might have been wondering where was the panic. And honestly, the way I recounted the story to you is how I experienced it. I didn't have panic come across me when I was doing this. I was thinking the entire time, and I was trying to deduce my way out of this. There was only one moment, which was when I tried to swim to what I thought was up for a couple minutes and ended up on the ocean floor, where I stopped to think, "Oh, I'm in a bad spot now," right? And that was the extent of my panic, right? And again, I don't think it was panic, it was just a realization. I was in control of myself the entire time and able to think through a difficult situation to be able to come out on top. And I credit martial arts to that, because I've been in lots of very bad positions in fighting, and panicking doesn't save you from that, right? If you panic when you're fighting, you're just gonna smash yourself, right? And I've been in spots where things went the worst way possible, right? My knee getting exploded by Baharas was again a spot where I knew I was in a bad spot, but I'm like, well, I'm just gonna have to do my best to get out of this. Or the time that Tarsus choked me unconscious, I was fighting the whole way through. I didn't, out of pride say, oh, I'm not gonna tap. I'm just gonna, let myself fall unconscious. It never occurred to me that I was gonna go out. I was defending the whole way. But I was staying as composed as I could and just doing my best to survive. And I feel that energy I brought into this event. And I've spoken to a few people who were rescue divers, and they, first of all, had never heard of somebody going blind in the water from a mask squeeze. So they were surprised that could happen. And I looked it up online, and it's very rare indeed that that does happen. And a guy as a rescue diver told me, I have friends that I've been working with for decades that if that would have happened to them, they would have drowned in the water. Right? He's like, the only thing that saved you was your martial arts experience. And so this is somebody with, experience in the field telling me that. And I tend to agree with that, right? That was my assessment as well. I don't find that I panic. When things get crazy, I think my way through them, right? Uh, and obviously, that probably saved my life, right? Um, I always try to tell people that, right? When things get bad, panicking is not going to make it better, right? I've never heard someone panic their way into a fortune, right? It's usually the other way around. They panic their way into disaster, right? So it's understandable why might get emotional or freak out because you're worried about losing something, whether it's, in this case, your life or, your fortune or a loved one. But you have to set those emotions aside and think pragmatically. How am I going to deal with this situation? What's the best way forward? What are the potential consequences? And then make a decision as far as which route you're going to choose. And that's how I went through it in my head. And it didn't take me long. Like I said, it probably took me about a minute to come up with my final plan. Fortunately, I didn't execute that plan, right? I, I just listened to my body, which was saying, hey, this mask is really tight, So again, I share this because, first of all, if anybody's into diving, I wanted to know about this so that if this ever happens to you or someone around you, you're better equipped to deal with it, right? Uh, Two, I feel this is probably my closest brush with death, right? Uh, and I'm proud of the way I was able to handle that, right? And I hope that that can inspire others to be able to deal with their own issues in a way that's better than even what I was able to produce, right? And to protect themselves and the people around them. And I think it's hopefully the way I listed out the the flaws in my approach to entering this, and then me being able to analyze after the event what went wrong, what went right, how am I going to prevent this from happening in the future, right? And not carrying a stigma around me anymore uh, was important for me because, well, maybe I don't know if I conveyed it well enough, but it was a little bit haunting for a few days putting on the hearing protection and just hearing the ocean. And then, especially when you're about to sleep, you're essentially being transported back into uh, into that bad environment that I was in for a moment. So I felt it was very important to quickly overcome that and not allow it to manifest into something further. Anyhow, I hope that story was entertaining to you and also, more importantly, informative. And that's all I got for you for this week. I'll see you all next week.